A racist police officer humiliated a woman by lifting her dress in front of a crowd. And what happened next will leave you speechless. What would you do if someone in authority crossed every boundary of decency, using their power to degrade and intimidate? On a busy street, a moment of supposed investigation turned into an act of public humiliation that stunned onlookers into silence. No one stepped forward. No one stopped it. Have you ever witnessed such an abuse of power, or worse, been the one subjected to it? These moments force us to question not only the systems that allow such actions, but also our own reactions to injustice. Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Lucy stepped out of the bustling Starbucks, her polished demeanor matching her crisp white dress. It had been a long day, and a brief meeting with friends had momentarily lifted her spirits. However, the calm shattered when two police officers approached her on the sidewalk. "Ma'am, stop right there," commanded Mark, the older of the two, his voice sharp and his gaze piercing. Mark's partner, Ethan, a younger and visibly less confident officer, stood a step behind, his eyes darting between Mark and Lucy. "Is there a problem?" Lucy asked, her tone polite but firm as she adjusted her grip on her handbag. "We've had reports of a theft in the area," Mark said, crossing his arms. "You fit the description of the suspect." Lucy blinked, stunned by the accusation. "Excuse me? I was just inside the Starbucks. I don't know anything about a theft." Mark's lips curled into a sneer. "You expect us to take your word for it? Hand over your bag for inspection." Her jaw tightened, indignation flashing in her eyes. "On what grounds? I haven't done anything wrong." Mark leaned closer, his voice dropping into a menacing tone. "You look like someone trying to hide something. Refusal will only make you look guiltier." A murmur rippled through the onlookers gathering nearby, some stopping to watch the exchange unfold. "What's going on here?" a middle-aged man muttered to his companion. "She's probably one of those rich types," another remarked, loud enough for Lucy to hear. "Thinks she's above the law." Lucy's cheeks flushed with anger and humiliation. She turned back to Mark, her voice steady, despite the rising tension. "I don't care how I look to you or anyone else here. You can't just stop me and accuse me without evidence." Mark's grin widened. "Let me make this clear. You don't have the right to refuse." Lucy stepped back, clutching her bag protectively. "I know my rights. If you think I've done something wrong, you can take me to the station and file a proper report. But I won't stand here and let you harass me in public." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his hesitation evident. "Mark, maybe we should stay out of this," Mark snapped without looking at his partner. He reached for Lucy's bag, his movements deliberate and forceful. "Don't touch me!" Lucy exclaimed, stepping further back. "You're overstepping your authority." By now, the small crowd had grown, their whispers becoming more pointed. "Why is she resisting if she's innocent?" someone questioned, feeding into the spectacle. Mark ignored the murmurs, his expression hardening. "Cooperate, or I'll have to take more serious measures." Lucy locked eyes with him, her defiance unwavering. "I won't let you intimidate me. Do your job correctly or leave me alone." Mark's patience snapped. "That's it. You think you're above the law? Watch how far your arrogance gets you." Ethan watched the scene with growing unease, the tension between Mark and Lucy thickening. His fingers twitched by his side, but fear of defying his superior kept him rooted in place. The standoff lingered, drawing more attention from bystanders. A woman named Nancy stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Officer, isn't this a bit much? She's clearly cooperating, and you're treating her like a criminal." Mark turned his glare to Nancy, his tone laced with disdain. "Mind your own business, ma'am, unless you'd like to be part of the investigation, too." Nancy recoiled but held her ground. "This isn't right. You're abusing your power." Mark ignored her, his focus returning to Lucy. "This is your last chance. Hand over the bag." "No," Lucy said firmly. Her refusal hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan took a small step forward, his voice low but audible. "Mark, maybe we should de-escalate. This doesn't feel right." Mark shot him a look so sharp it could cut steel. "Are you questioning my authority?" Ethan froze, his mouth clamping shut. Mark's hand hovered near Lucy's bag again, his intentions clear. The air buzzed with anticipation as the crowd leaned in, waiting to see what would happen next. Lucy braced herself, her heart pounding. She wasn't going to back down, no matter how aggressive he became. Mark's face twisted with cold determination as Lucy's defiance seemed to fuel his need for control. He stepped closer, ignoring the murmuring crowd. "Why are you here, miss?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery. Suspiciously near the scene of a crime, aren't you? Got something to hide? I told you, Lucy said sharply. I came from the Starbucks. There's nothing to hide. Mark smirked. If you're innocent, you wouldn't mind proving it. Without waiting for her response, he suddenly grabbed her handbag, yanking it open. Lucy gasped, her hands darting forward to snatch it back, but Mark shoved her aside with ease. He rummaged through the contents, pulling out her wallet, makeup, and phone, tossing them onto the pavement like garbage. You can't do this, Lucy exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger. This is harassment. Mark held up her empty bag with exaggerated disdain. Well, nothing here. But you know, criminals are crafty. He dropped the bag and folded his arms. Maybe you're hiding something elsewhere. Lucy's heart raced. Don't you dare, she hissed, stepping back, her hands gripping the hem of her dress instinctively. I'll decide what's necessary, Mark said, his voice cold as steel. He crouched suddenly, his hand darting toward the hem of her dress. Lucy screamed, slapping his hand away. Get off me! The crowd gasped. A few onlookers stepped closer, their faces showing shock and unease, but no one intervened. This is going too far, Nancy shouted again, her voice cutting through the tension. She moved toward Mark, her hands clenched into fists. Leave her alone. Mark spun to face her, his glare sharp and unforgiving. Step back, lady. Unless you want to be charged with obstruction? Nancy froze, her courage faltering as Mark straightened up, his imposing frame towering over her. You can't treat people this way, she said, her voice weaker now. I treat them however I need to, Mark snapped, turning back to Lucy. Lucy stood her ground, her hands gripping her dress tightly. You won't touch me, she said, her voice quivering but firm. Mark sneered. We'll see about that. He reached forward again, grabbing at the fabric of her dress. Lucy fought back, slapping his hand and trying to twist away, but his strength was overwhelming. With a sharp tug, he lifted the hem of her dress above her knees. No! Lucy screamed, her voice breaking with humiliation and rage. She clawed at his hands, kicking out to free herself. The crowd erupted into a cacophony of gasps and murmurs. Some turned away, unable to watch, while others whispered judgmental remarks. What kind of woman resists like that? She must be hiding something, a man muttered under his breath, his companion nodding in agreement. Nancy, tears in her eyes, looked around at the bystanders. Why won't anyone stop him? She pleaded. Stay out of it, someone hissed. You don't want trouble. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Mark, this isn't right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark shot him a glare that silenced him instantly. You don't get to decide what's right. Watch and learn. Lucy's strength was no match for Mark's brute force. He shoved her back against the wall, holding her dress firmly. The world seemed to close in on her, the whispers of the crowd like 1,000 needles prickling her skin. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This is illegal, she shouted, her voice hoarse. You're violating my rights. Mark ignored her, his face twisted with a mix of satisfaction and scorn. You think your rights matter when you look guilty? Finally, Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. Mark, stop. This is going too far. Mark's head snapped around, his eyes locking onto Ethan's with a fury that froze him in place. Are you forgetting who's in charge here? Ethan faltered, stepping back. I just think, don't think, Mark growled. Do your job. Lucy's voice cracked as she yelled, You're not above the law. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. Mark chuckled darkly. You, against me? Go ahead, sweetheart. No one's going to believe a word you say. A new wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Some appeared sympathetic, their faces etched with discomfort, but they kept their distance. Lucy's hands clenched into fists, her body trembling with a mix of rage and humiliation. Her voice dropped to a chilling calm. You'll regret this. Mark tossed her dress back into place with an air of mockery and stepped back, crossing his arms. Good luck with that. Lucy bent down, gathering her scattered belongings from the ground, her hands shaking but deliberate. She shot a glance at Ethan, who looked away, his guilt evident. The onlookers began to disperse, their curiosity waning now that the spectacle seemed to be over. Nancy lingered, her face full of sorrow and anger. I'm so sorry, she whispered to Lucy, her voice cracking. Lucy gave her a tight nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned and walked away, her steps quick and deliberate, her shoulders stiff with humiliation and fury. Lucy slammed her apartment door shut, the noise echoing in the quiet room. She stood frozen, clutching her handbag like it was the only thing holding her together. Her reflection in the hallway mirror caught her eye, her tear-streaked face, her disheveled dress, the raw humiliation still burning in her expression. Her phone buzzed in her bag, jolting her back to reality. She pulled it out and saw Helen's name flashing on the screen. "Lucy, are you okay?" Helen's voice came through immediately, laced with concern. "No," Lucy replied, her voice trembling. "It was horrible. I can't even—" Her words broke off, replaced by a choked sob. "Start from the beginning," Helen urged. "Tell me everything." Lucy relayed the incident in halting sentences, her anger and humiliation spilling over as she recounted Mark's actions, the bystanders' indifference, and Ethan's silence. Helen's voice hardened. "That man is a monster. He can't get away with this." Lucy collapsed onto the couch, her grip on the phone tightening. "I feel so powerless. No one helped me. They just stood there, watching." "That's what they want you to feel," Helen replied sharply. "If they can break your spirit, they win. But you're stronger than this." Lucy's breathing steadied, though the fire in her chest refused to die down. "How do I fight back against someone like him? He's a cop, Helen. People will believe him over me." "Not if you make them listen," Helen said firmly. "I know what it feels like to be in your position. Years ago, I was harassed at work. My boss thought he could intimidate me into silence, but I fought back. It wasn't easy, Lucy, but I didn't let him win." Lucy was silent for a moment, Helen's words stirring something deep within her. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "I reported him," Helen said. "It didn't change everything overnight, but it started something. He was eventually fired because others came forward too. You have to start somewhere, Lucy. You can't let this go." Lucy stared at the ceiling, Helen's story playing in her mind. Memories from her own life surfaced, moments when she had seen others face injustice, but remained silent, afraid to get involved. She remembered a colleague being ridiculed by a manager, a friend being harassed by a stranger on the subway. Each time she had convinced herself it wasn't her battle to fight. "I've stood by too many times," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending it's not my problem. Not this time." Helen's voice softened but stayed resolute. "That's the right attitude. It's not just about you, Lucy. It's about making sure he doesn't do this to anyone else." Lucy sat up, a spark of determination igniting in her chest. "What do I do? How do I start?" "I know a group," Helen said without hesitation. "They're advocates for women's rights. They've dealt with cases like this before. I'll send you their contact info." Lucy nodded, even though Helen couldn't see her. "I'll call them." "Good. And Lucy? Yes? You're not alone. No matter what happens, I'll be right here with you." Tears welled up in Lucy's eyes again, but this time, they weren't just from pain. "Thank you, Helen. That means everything." After ending the call, Lucy took a deep breath and opened her laptop. She typed out every detail she could remember, her fingers trembling but determined. The sneer on Mark's face, Ethan's hesitant glances, the crowd's whispers. It all went into her account. As she wrote, her fear began to shift into something more focused, more powerful. She wasn't just a victim, she was a voice. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Helen popped up with a link to the advocacy group. Lucy clicked on it, reading through their mission statement and testimonials. Each word strengthened her resolve. "This isn't over," Lucy whispered to herself. Not by a long shot. With Helen's support and a newfound determination, Lucy prepared to take her first step toward seeking justice, reaching out to the organization that could help her fight back. Lucy sat at her desk, her laptop glowing in the dimly lit room. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, crafting a detailed statement about the incident. She described every word, every action, and every humiliating moment with precision. As she typed, she fought back the lingering fear and transformed it into resolve. The next morning, Lucy reached out to the women's advocacy group Helen had recommended. After explaining her situation to a caseworker named Sarah, she was scheduled for a consultation. "We've dealt with cases involving law enforcement misconduct before," Sarah assured her over the phone. "But it'll require strong evidence and witnesses. Are you ready to take this forward?" Lucy hesitated, but nodded to herself. "I'm ready. I can't let him keep doing this." Later that afternoon, Lucy stepped out of a local cafe after her meeting with Sarah, her head spinning with the plan they had outlined. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and froze. Blocked number. "You think you can win against me? Be careful what you wish for." A cold chill ran down her spine. She scanned her surroundings, but saw no one suspicious. Shaking off the unease, she quickly forwarded the message to Sarah, who promised to include it as evidence. Meanwhile, Mark was on patrol in a different part of the city. He spotted a young woman, Isabel, standing nervously by a bus stop. She was scrolling through her phone, unaware of his approach. "Excuse me, miss," Mark said, stepping into her space with a practiced air of authority. Isabel flinched, clutching her bag. "Yes? There's been a report of suspicious activity nearby. Can I see your identification?" "I don't have my ID with me," Isabel replied hesitantly. "I was just waiting for the bus." Mark's lips curled into a predatory smile. "No ID? That's against the law. I'll need to check your bag." "Wait, why? I didn't do anything," Isabel protested, stepping back. Mark ignored her and grabbed the bag from her hands, pulling it open. Her belongings spilled onto the ground, and Isabel bent to pick them up. "Don't move," Mark barked, grabbing her wrist to stop her. Isabel's eyes filled with tears. "Please, stop. You're hurting me." Ethan stood a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. His stomach churned with guilt and anger. He had seen enough of Mark's behavior to know this wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about power. "Mark," Ethan said cautiously, stepping closer. "She's cooperating. Maybe we should let her go." Mark turned his head sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this." "But she's clearly not." Mark's hand shot up, cutting him off. His voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "Do you want to keep your badge, Ethan? Because if you don't, I can make that happen." Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He clenched his fists at his sides, the urge to intervene clashing with his fear of retaliation. Mark released Isabel's wrist and tossed her bag back at her. "Next time, carry your ID. Now get out of here." Isabel scrambled to collect her belongings, tears streaming down her face as she fled the scene. Ethan watched her go, shame weighing heavily on him. As he turned back to Mark, his superior smirked. "You've got a lot to learn about this job, kid. Stick with me, and you'll survive." That evening, Lucy was walking home when she noticed a car idling near her building. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. The car rolled forward slowly, its tinted windows obscuring the driver. She darted inside her building and bolted the door behind her, her breath coming in short gasps. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was from an unregistered number. "Nice place you've got. Be a shame if something happened to it." Lucy gripped the phone tightly, her hands trembling. She immediately called Sarah, who reassured her that they would notify the police department about the intimidation tactics. But Lucy knew that Mark's connections within the system made him feel untouchable. Ethan sat in his small apartment, staring at his phone. He had found Lucy's name online and had been debating for hours whether to contact her. He wanted to help, but Mark's threat loomed large in his mind. Finally, he typed out a message. "I know what happened. I want to help, but it's risky for me to come forward. I've seen what Mark is capable of." He hovered over the send button, his finger trembling. Before he could press it, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Mark. "Ethan," Mark said, his tone deceptively casual. "I heard you've been asking questions about that woman from the other day." Ethan's blood ran cold. "I wasn't." "Don't lie to me," Mark interrupted. "You think I don't know what you're up to? Let me make this clear. If you cross me, your career is over, and I won't stop there." The line went dead, leaving Ethan staring at his phone in horror. He deleted the unsent message to Lucy and buried his face in his hands. Lucy spent the next few days feeling like she was being watched. Every time she left her apartment, she scanned her surroundings, half expecting Mark to appear. But instead of retreating into fear, she grew more determined. She called Helen one evening. "This isn't just about me," Lucy said, her voice steady. "If he's done this to me, he's done it to others. I need to find them." Helen's voice was filled with encouragement. "Then let's do it. We'll find the people he's hurt, and we'll make sure his actions come to light." Lucy hung up and stared at the list of advocacy contacts Sarah had sent her. Her hands were no longer shaking. She had a plan, and she wasn't going to back down. As Lucy began reaching out to potential witnesses and allies, she realized that her fight was no longer personal. It was a battle against a deeply entrenched system that protected men like Mark. Alexander sat at his computer, scrolling through forums and social media, typing variations of police abuse, harassment by cops, and victim of Officer Mark into the search bar. He sifted through countless posts, many of them vague or unrelated, until one caught his attention. "A man in uniform humiliated me on the street, claiming I looked suspicious. He abused his authority, and no one did anything to stop him. I'm scared to speak out." The post, written months earlier by someone named Marina, immediately struck a chord. Alexander's instincts told him this could be a lead. Without wasting time, he sent her a private message. Hi, Marina. My name is Alexander. My wife was recently a victim of a similar incident involving an officer named Mark. We're building a case to stop him and are looking for others who've had similar experiences. Please, if you're willing, let's talk. You're not alone in this. Hours passed without a reply. Alexander's mind raced, imagining the fear she might be feeling. He wasn't sure she would respond, but then his phone buzzed. Marina's cautious reply appeared, "Who are you and how do I know this isn't a trap?" Alexander exhaled and quickly typed back, "I understand your hesitation. My wife, Lucy, experienced what sounds like the same abuse. We're working with an advocacy group to expose this officer. You can trust us." 2 days later, Marina agreed to meet, but her terms were clear. A public place, no recordings, and no promises to testify. Alexander and Lucy waited at a small cafe, their eyes scanning the room nervously until a young woman stepped in. She wore a hoodie pulled tightly over her head and sunglasses, her posture tense and wary. "Marina?" Alexander asked as he stood to greet her. She nodded but didn't sit. "I don't have much time. What do you want to know?" Alexander gestured for her to sit, keeping his tone calm. "Anything you're comfortable sharing. Did Officer Mark hurt you?" Marina hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. "He humiliated me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a few months ago. I was walking home after work, and he stopped me. Said I matched the description of a thief." Lucy leaned forward, her expression empathetic. "Did he search you?" Marina nodded, her voice shaking. "He didn't just search me. He dragged me into an alley and made me empty my pockets, then my bag. When he didn't find anything, he said he needed to check if I was hiding anything on my body." Lucy's hands clenched into fists, but she kept her voice steady. "Did anyone help you?" "No one," Marina said bitterly. "There were people around, but they just stared. I wanted to scream, but I was too afraid." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "He touched me. He used his badge to make me feel powerless. I couldn't do anything." Alexander exchanged a glance with Lucy. "You're not powerless now, Marina. If you're willing to speak up, we can stop him from hurting anyone else." Marina shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. "I can't. He'll find me. He'll make my life a nightmare." Before Alexander could respond, Lucy placed a hand on Marina's. "I know it's terrifying, but Mark only gets away with this because we stay silent. If we stand together, we can fight back. You don't have to do this alone." Marina didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the table. Finally, she whispered, "I'll think about it." Later that evening, Marina left work and headed to the bus stop. Her nerves were on edge after the meeting, and every shadow seemed to hold danger. As she turned the corner, a car pulled up beside her, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The passenger window rolled down, and her heart sank. Mark's cold, familiar face appeared, his voice calm but menacing. "You've been busy, Marina, talking to the wrong people." She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. "I haven't done anything," she stammered. Mark smirked. "Good. Let's keep it that way. Stay quiet, and you won't have any problems." Before she could respond, another car pulled up behind Mark's. Alexander stepped out, his face set in grim determination. "Mark!" he called, his voice echoing down the street. Mark's smirk vanished as he turned to face Alexander. "You've got a habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Alexander strode forward, positioning himself between Mark and Marina. "And you've got a habit of abusing your badge. This ends now." Mark laughed, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think you can stop me? You're out of your depth." "I think you're scared," Alexander shot back. "Scared that the truth is catching up to you." Mark's expression hardened. "Careful, or you'll regret this." "Not as much as you will," Alexander said, his voice steady. Mark held Alexander's gaze for a moment longer before stepping back toward his car. "Stay out of my way," he warned, then drove off into the night. Marina clutched her bag tightly, her hands trembling. He's not going to stop, she said, her voice cracking. He'll stop, Alexander assured her. We'll make sure of it. But we need your help. After a long pause, Marina nodded. Okay, I'll do it. I'll testify. That night, Alexander relayed everything to Lucy. She's agreed to testify, he said, his relief evident. But we need more people. Mark's been doing this for too long. Lucy nodded. We'll find them. One by one. We'll bring them forward. He won't get away with this. With Marina's decision to testify, Alexander became more determined than ever to find additional victims, knowing that every new voice would strengthen their case against Mark. Alexander reviewed the growing file of evidence on their kitchen table, his laptop open to a message from another potential victim. Caroline, a cashier at a local supermarket, had described an encounter with Mark that mirrored Marina's and Lucy's stories. He leaned back in his chair, glancing at Lucy. I think Caroline could be a key witness, he said. Then let's reach out, Lucy replied firmly. At the supermarket, Caroline stood behind her register, scanning items with mechanical precision. The memory of Mark's actions months earlier still haunted her, though she had tried to bury it. Alexander approached her during her break, introducing himself and explaining why he had come. Caroline stiffened, her eyes narrowing. How do I know you're not just stirring up trouble? I understand your hesitation, Alexander said calmly. But my wife and others have been through the same thing. We're building a case to stop him for good. Caroline hesitated, her gaze darting to her co-workers, some of whom were watching curiously. I don't want to get involved. People here already think I'm making a big deal out of nothing. What happened wasn't nothing, Alexander pressed. If we stay silent, he wins, and he'll keep hurting people. Caroline sighed, running a hand through her hair. He stopped me outside this store after my shift. Said I looked suspicious, like I'd stolen something. Then he searched my bag in front of my co-workers and customers. It was humiliating. And he didn't find anything? Alexander asked. Of course not, Caroline said bitterly. But that didn't stop him. He grabbed me, tore my blouse, and called me a liar. Everyone just stood there staring. Her voice cracked and she looked away. I can't go through that again. People here already gossip about me, saying I just want attention. Lucy stepped forward, her voice steady but compassionate. Caroline, I understand how it feels to be judged by people who don't know the truth. But this isn't about them. It's about stopping him from doing this to anyone else. Caroline met Lucy's gaze, her defenses faltering. You really think it'll make a difference? I do, Lucy said firmly. But we need your voice. Caroline swallowed hard, then nodded. Fine. I'll do it. But if this blows up, I'm holding you both accountable. Next, Alexander contacted Clara, a single mother who had written anonymously online about an encounter with Mark. Convincing her to meet wasn't easy. She canceled twice before finally agreeing. At a small park, Clara sat on a bench, her arms crossed defensively. I don't know why I'm even here, she said as Alexander and Lucy approached. I have 2 kids to think about. I can't afford to make enemies. We're not asking you to take unnecessary risks, Alexander said gently. But your story could help protect other mothers, other families, from going through what you did. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. He stopped me when I was walking my kids home from school, said I looked like someone they were looking for. When I asked what I'd done, he got angry. He made me open my bag right there on the street. Lucy leaned in. What did he do when he didn't find anything? Clara hesitated, her voice trembling. He grabbed my shoulder, said I was obstructing an investigation, and pulled at my shirt to check for hidden items. My kids were crying, and people just walked by like it was normal. That's not normal, Lucy said softly. And it's not okay. Clara shook her head. I can't put my kids through more. If he finds out I talked, who knows what he'll do? Alexander spoke up, his voice resolute. Clara, if we don't stand up to him, he'll keep doing this. Your kids deserve a world where people like him don't get to abuse their power. You can help make that happen. Clara looked at the playground where her children were playing, her expression torn. Finally, she exhaled. All right, I'll do it, but only if you promise to protect my family. You have our word, Alexander said. That evening, Lucy, Alexander, Marina, Caroline, and Clara met at the advocacy group's office. Sarah, the caseworker, greeted them with a warm smile. Thank you all for being here. Together, you're making this case much stronger. Marina looked at Caroline and Clara, her voice tentative. It helps knowing I'm not the only one. For a while, I thought maybe I was just unlucky. You're not alone, Caroline replied, her voice firm despite her earlier hesitation. He's done this to all of us, and it's time he paid for it. Clara nodded, her gaze steady. We can't let him keep thinking he's untouchable. Sarah outlined the next steps, including preparing their testimonies and gathering any additional evidence. The atmosphere in the room shifted from fear to determination as each woman realized the strength they had found in one another. As Alexander and Lucy walked home that night, Lucy turned to him. We're making progress, but it's still not enough. We need more voices, more evidence. Alexander nodded. We'll find them. Mark's been doing this for too long. His time is up. With 3 victims now united, the case against Mark began to take shape. But Alexander and Lucy knew the fight was far from over. They resolved to keep searching for more evidence and witnesses to ensure Mark's reign of abuse would finally come to an end. Ethan sat alone in his small apartment, his thoughts a tangled web of guilt and fear. Mark's voice echoed in his mind. Stick with me, and you'll survive. Cross me, and you won't have a career left. He replayed the scene at the bus stop with Isabel. Her tear-streaked face haunted him. He knew Mark had crossed every line of decency, yet he had stood by, paralyzed by fear. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. We're on patrol tomorrow. Don't forget who's got your back. Ethan put the phone down, his stomach churning. It wasn't just Mark's threats. It was the system that protected men like him. But how could he, a junior officer, challenge it? The next day at the precinct, Ethan kept his distance from Mark, but the older officer's presence was inescapable. During a quiet moment in the break room, Ethan's colleague, Officer Ryan, sat beside him. You look like hell, Ryan said, his voice low. Something on your mind? Ethan hesitated. Ryan had always been one of the more level-headed officers, but trust didn't come easily. It's complicated. Ryan leaned closer, his tone serious. Is it about Mark? Ethan's eyes widened, but he didn't respond. You don't have to say it, Ryan continued. I've heard things, seen things. He's been a problem for years, but no one wants to rock the boat because they're scared, Ethan muttered. Ryan nodded. And for good reason. Mark's got connections. But let me tell you something. Staying silent doesn't make it better. It just makes you complicit. Ethan felt a surge of anger, not at Ryan, but at himself. What am I supposed to do? If I speak out, I'm done. Ryan's gaze was steady. Or maybe you'll be the one to finally stop him. It's your choice, Ethan. Just remember, the longer you wait, the harder it gets. That night, Ethan paced his apartment, Ryan's words ringing in his ears. His phone sat on the table, open to the number of the women's advocacy group Lucy was working with. He had saved it days ago, but hadn't dared to call. Finally, he grabbed the phone and dialed. A calm professional voice answered. Women's Advocacy Network, this is Sarah. How can I help you? Ethan's throat tightened. For a moment, he considered hanging up, but he forced himself to speak. My name is Ethan. I'm a police officer. I need to talk to someone about misconduct. Thank you for reaching out, Sarah said gently. Can you tell me more about what's going on? Ethan took a deep breath and began. I've seen things. From my partner, Mark. He's abusing his power, targeting women. I didn't stop him. It's not too late to make it right, Sarah replied. Anything you can share could make a big difference. I have information, Ethan admitted. Dates, incidents, even messages he sent me. But if I come forward, he'll destroy me. Sarah's tone was reassuring but firm. We understand the risks. If you're willing to meet, we can help protect you and ensure your testimony makes an impact. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Okay, Let's meet. The following evening, Ethan sat across from Sarah and Lucy at a small, discreet cafe. His hands trembled slightly as he passed over his notes. Mark thinks he's untouchable, Ethan said. He's got friends in high places, and he uses that to cover his tracks. But these are some of the incidents I've documented. Isabel, Clara, Caroline. He targeted all of them while I was there. Lucy leaned forward, her voice sharp. Why didn't you stop him? Ethan looked down, shame flashing across his face. Because I was scared. I thought keeping quiet would protect me. But now I see that staying silent makes me just as guilty. Sarah placed a hand on Lucy's arm, signaling patience. Ethan, this information is critical. Your testimony could validate everything these women are saying. Are you prepared to go on record? Ethan swallowed hard. Yes, I have to. He needs to be stopped. 2 days later, Mark noticed Ethan's unease during their patrol. You've been acting strange, Mark said as they drove through the city. Just tired, Ethan replied quickly. Mark wasn't convinced. Tired, huh? You're not thinking about doing something stupid, are you? What's that supposed to mean? Ethan asked, keeping his tone neutral. Mark's eyes narrowed. You're not exactly subtle, Ethan. Don't forget, loyalty is what keeps this team running. Cross me, and I'll bury you. Ethan clenched his fists, but said nothing. Later that night, Ethan sat with Ryan in the precinct's parking lot. I talked to them, Ethan said quietly. The advocacy group. They're taking my statement. Ryan's expression was a mix of surprise and admiration. That's a big step. It doesn't feel like enough, Ethan admitted. Mark's still out there, doing whatever he wants. It's more than most people have done, Ryan said. And if you stick to it, it'll be enough to take him down. Ethan's official testimony, combined with the evidence he provided, became a cornerstone of the case. Dates, times, and specific incidents he had documented corroborated the victims' accounts, giving their claims undeniable weight. Lucy, upon hearing the details of Ethan's statement, felt a mix of anger and relief. He's finally stepping up, she said to Alexander. This could change everything. Let's hope it's enough, Alexander replied. With Ethan's testimony solidifying their case, the team felt a surge of momentum. But they knew Mark wouldn't go down without a fight. Rose sat at the head of the table in a small conference room, surrounded by stacks of files, witness statements, and legal briefs. Beside her, Pablo, a sharp-eyed attorney with years of courtroom experience, meticulously reviewed the latest evidence. We're up against more than Mark, Rose said, her tone firm. His friends in the department are working to discredit our witnesses and suppress the case. We need to be airtight. Pablo nodded, flipping through a file. Ethan's testimony gives us a strong foundation, but Mark's team will attack his credibility. If they can paint him as disgruntled or biased, it could undermine everything. Across the table, Lucy, Marina, Caroline, and Clara listened intently. Marina fidgeted with her hands, her unease evident. What if they tear us apart on the stand? She asked. They'll try, Pablo admitted. But that's why we're here, to prepare you. He gestured to the folder in front of him. We'll go over every question they're likely to ask and how to respond without giving them ammunition. As the session progressed, Pablo played the role of the defense lawyer, grilling each woman with pointed, sometimes invasive questions. Marina, he began, you claim Officer Mark harassed you. But isn't it true you've had legal trouble in the past? Marina froze, her face paling. That has nothing to do with... Answer the question, Pablo interrupted, his tone sharp. Marina glanced at Rose, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she responded, Yes, but that doesn't justify what Mark did to me. Pablo leaned back, dropping the act. Good. Stay calm and stick to the facts. They'll try to rattle you, but as long as you don't take the bait, they'll have nothing. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Mark sat in a dimly lit office with Officer Turner, a longtime ally. Turner leaned back in his chair, a smug grin on his face. You've got nothing to worry about, Turner said. We've buried cases worse than this. A few phone calls and half their evidence could disappear. Mark smirked but didn't relax. What about Ethan? He's the weak link. Turner waved dismissively. Leave him to me. By the time I'm done, he won't know which way is up. As for the women, we'll spread rumors, muddy their reputations, make them look like opportunists. Mark leaned forward, his expression dark. Do it. I want this case dead before it reaches trial. Back at the advocacy office, Rose received an alarming email. They're claiming some of our evidence was improperly obtained, she announced, her voice tight. Pablo frowned. Which evidence? The surveillance footage from the supermarket, Rose replied. They're arguing it was accessed without a proper warrant. Lucy's heart sank. But that footage proves what Caroline said. Don't panic, Pablo said. We anticipated they'd pull something like this. I'll file a motion to defend its admissibility. But it's a reminder that they'll exploit every loophole. As the days wore on, the pressure took its toll. Clara called Lucy late one night, her voice trembling. I don't think I can do this, she confessed. Mark has friends everywhere. What if they come after my kids? Lucy felt a pang of sympathy but spoke with conviction. Clara, I know you're scared. We all are. But if we back down, he wins. Your testimony could be what stops him from doing this to someone else's children. Clara hesitated, her fear evident. I just don't know if I'm strong enough. You are, Lucy said firmly. I've seen it. You stood up for your kids when Mark humiliated you. That same strength is what we need now. There was a long pause. Then Clara whispered, I'll stay. The following morning, Rose gathered the group for their final meeting before the trial. They've thrown everything at us, she began, her voice steady. But we've held firm. Now it's time to finish this. Pablo handed out final copies of their statements. Review these carefully. The defense will try to twist your words. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and don't engage with their attempts to provoke you. Marina raised her hand. What if they ask about things from our past? Things unrelated to Mark? They will, Rose admitted. And when they do, redirect. Acknowledge the question, then bring the focus back to the incident. For example, if they ask about a past arrest, say, yes, but that doesn't change what Officer Mark did to me on this date. The group nodded, their determination solidifying. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, Lucy stood with Alexander. This is it, she said quietly. Everything we've worked for comes down to this. You've done everything right, Alexander replied. Now, we trust the process. Lucy looked at the women gathering nearby. Marina, Caroline, Clara, and even Ethan, who approached cautiously. They had all come so far, and despite the fear that lingered, there was an undeniable sense of unity. With their strategy finalized and their resolve strengthened, the group was ready to face Mark in court. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, the sound of the gavel slicing through the tension. Mark sat at the defense table, his face impassive, but the cold glint in his eyes betrayed his confidence. Across the room, Lucy sat with Marina, Caroline, and Clara, their expressions resolute. Pablo rose first, his opening statement calm but firm. Your Honor, this case is about a man who abused the power entrusted to him. We will present testimonies and evidence that prove a pattern of misconduct and systemic failure to protect those most vulnerable. Mark's lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Douglas Price, countered smoothly. The defense will show that these accusations are not only baseless but are part of a coordinated attempt to tarnish an officer's reputation. My client has served this community with distinction, and we will demonstrate his innocence. Marina was the first to take the stand. As she swore the oath, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady when she began. He stopped me on my way home, accused me of theft without cause, and searched me in an alley. He touched me without consent. Price rose, his expression calculating. Miss Marina, you've had legal troubles in the past, haven't you? How can we trust your word? Marina's face flushed, but she met his gaze. My past doesn't justify what he did. I know what happened, and it was wrong. Price smirked. Or perhaps you saw this as an opportunity. A chance to fabricate a story for personal gain? Marina's voice didn't waver. I gain nothing from reliving this. I'm here because he needs to be held accountable. Pablo stood. Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained, the judge said. Next was Caroline. She walked to the stand with her head held high, though tension gripped her shoulders. Mark humiliated me in front of my coworkers and customers. He grabbed my bag, ripped my blouse, and accused me of stealing without evidence. Price pounced immediately. Mrs. Caroline, do you have any proof of these events? Any video? Any witnesses willing to corroborate? I don't need video for the truth to be heard, Caroline replied. And my coworkers were too scared to stand up just like I was. Until now. Price's voice sharpened. So you're admitting this is hearsay? Caroline leaned forward, her voice fierce. I'm admitting that people are afraid of him. That's why it's taken this long to speak out. But fear doesn't make what happened any less real. Clara's testimony was filled with raw emotion. He searched me on the street in front of my children. They were terrified. He used his badge like a weapon. Price moved to discredit her. You claim your children witnessed this. Where are they now? Why aren't they here to testify? They're children, Clara shot back. They shouldn't have to relive what he put us through. I'm their voice. Rose interjected with evidence, a written statement Clara's eldest child had provided, describing the incident in detail. Price attempted to object, but the judge allowed it, further solidifying Clara's account. Finally, Ethan was called to the stand. The room seemed to hold its breath as the young officer adjusted the microphone. He avoided looking at Mark, focusing on the judge instead. I worked alongside Mark, Ethan began, his voice steady. I witnessed his behavior firsthand, how he targeted women, used intimidation, and overstepped boundaries. Price wasted no time. Officer Ethan, aren't you bitter about your position? Isn't it true you were reprimanded for insubordination? Ethan didn't flinch. I wasn't reprimanded for insubordination. I was reprimanded for questioning Mark's methods. There's a difference. Price's tone grew sharper. Is it possible your testimony is influenced by personal vendetta? No, Ethan said firmly. My testimony is influenced by what I saw, a pattern of abuse that went unchecked for far too long. Ethan then detailed specific instances, including dates and descriptions, each aligning with the victim's accounts. His testimony provided the missing link, corroborating their stories with insider knowledge. When Mark took the stand, his lawyer's strategy was clear. Maintain control and deny everything. These allegations are absurd, Mark said, his tone calm but clipped. I acted within the scope of my duties at all times. Pablo approached the stand, his questions cutting straight to the core. Officer Mark, can you explain why multiple victims who don't know each other have described similar patterns of misconduct from you? Mark shrugged. Coincidence. People will say anything to attack someone in authority. And what about Ethan's testimony? Pablo pressed. He worked beside you. Is he lying too? Mark's jaw tightened. He doesn't understand how the job works. He's young, inexperienced. Pablo held up a transcript of Ethan's testimony. He detailed specific instances where you targeted women without cause. Can you refute those claims? I did what was necessary in the moment, Mark replied, his composure slipping slightly. And what about the text messages you sent Ethan, warning him to stay loyal or face consequences? Pablo asked, presenting evidence. Mark's face darkened. I don't recall sending those. But you admit they're from your phone? Pablo countered. Mark hesitated, then said, yes, but they were taken out of context. Pablo leaned in. What context, Officer Mark, would justify threatening a colleague to stay silent? Mark opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, his expression faltering. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as his mask of confidence cracked. In his closing argument, Pablo addressed the jury. This case is about more than one man's abuse of power. It's about accountability and ensuring that no one, no matter their position, is above the law. The evidence, the testimonies, they all point to one undeniable truth. Mark used his badge to harm, not protect. Price countered with an aggressive defense, claiming the victims were opportunistic and the evidence circumstantial. But his argument seemed weaker in the face of the overwhelming consistency among the witnesses. As the trial adjourned for the day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Lucy sat quietly, her hands clenched in her lap. It's not over yet, she said to Alexander. But it's a start. he replied. The trial moved into its next phase, with the evidence mounting against Mark and the courtroom bracing for the decisive moments to come. The courtroom drama spilled into the streets as headlines blared the unfolding scandal. Officer accused of systemic abuse. Victims speak out, one article read, detailing the testimonies of Marina, Caroline, Clara, and Ethan. Social media erupted with debates, hashtags like Grand Justice for Lucy and the Hold Cops Accountable trending within hours. Mark sat in his lawyer's office, scrolling through the articles on his phone. His jaw tightened as he read the comments. Finally, someone standing up to this kind of abuse. Why does this keep happening? The system protects these people. Douglas Price, his lawyer, watched him from across the desk. We can still turn this around, Price said. People forget quickly. We'll discredit the witnesses, paint this as a smear campaign. Mark looked up, his expression grim. It's not enough. They're all against me now. Even the department's distancing themselves. They're protecting their image, Price replied. They won't publicly support you, but they're not going to let you sink either. We have allies. Mark leaned back, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. Then we need to use them. I'm not going down for this. Meanwhile, another article appeared online. The blue wall cracks. Officer testifies against colleague, the headline read, focusing on Ethan's damning testimony. The article highlighted his courage in breaking ranks, praising him as a whistleblower. In the precinct, Mark's former allies exchanged nervous glances. Did you see what Ethan said? One officer muttered. If this blows up, it's not just him on the line. Turner, one of Mark's closest confidants, shook his head. Ethan's a traitor. He's letting these civilians dictate how we do our jobs. Or maybe he's tired of covering for Mark, another officer murmured, earning a sharp glare from Turner. The next day in court, Mark's temper began to show. Pablo presented an email chain between Mark and a superior officer, subtly pressuring others to dismiss complaints against him. Officer Mark, Pablo began, his tone measured. Can you explain why multiple complaints against you were closed without proper investigation? Mark leaned forward, his voice clipped. Those complaints were baseless. People file grievances all the time to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. And yet, the complaints all describe similar patterns, Pablo pressed. Intimidation, inappropriate searches, physical force. Are you suggesting every single complainant fabricated their story? Mark's face darkened. Yes, they're criminals. They'll say anything to get out of trouble. The judge frowned at his tone. Officer Mark, control your language. Mark took a deep breath, but the cracks in his composure were evident. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, their signs declaring support for the victims and calling for accountability. Clara watched from the steps, her children by her side. One sign caught her eye. Protect the people, not the badge. It's about time, Clara murmured. Lucy stood nearby with Marina and Caroline. The more attention this gets, the harder it'll be for them to sweep it under the rug, she said. But it also makes Mark more desperate, Marina pointed out, her voice wary. He's losing his grip, Lucy replied, and he knows it. In the courtroom, Douglas Price tried to shift the narrative. Your Honor, he began, addressing the judge. This case is being tried in the court of public opinion. My client cannot receive a fair trial under these circumstances. Pablo shot to his feet. Objection. The defense is attempting to deflect from the facts. The public's response has no bearing on the evidence presented here. Sustained, the judge said. Proceed with the evidence. Pablo nodded and turned back to Mark. Officer Mark, earlier you testified that you acted within the scope of your duties. Yet here, he held up a report, you described the victims as troublemakers in internal communications. Can you explain that? Mark hesitated, his face twitching. It was shorthand. I didn't mean it literally. And the threats to Officer Ethan. Were those shorthand too? Pablo asked, his tone sharp. Mark's jaw tightened. I never threatened him. I simply reminded him of the importance of loyalty. Loyalty to what? Pablo pressed. To the badge? Or to covering up your actions? Mark leaned forward, his voice rising. Loyalty to the system that keeps us safe. The courtroom buzzed, the tension palpable. Pablo stepped back, letting Mark's words linger. That evening, Mark met Turner in a secluded bar. This is getting out of hand, Mark growled. If I go down, I'm taking people with me. Turner nodded grimly. We've done what we can, but the pressure's too high. The brass won't back you if it means risking their own positions. Mark slammed his fist on the table. Cowards. All of them. Turner hesitated before speaking. You might need to cut a deal, Mark. Admit to something minor, take a slap on the wrist, and walk away. Mark glared at him. I don't admit to anything. They'll have to drag me out kicking and screaming. As the trial neared its conclusion, public interest reached a fever pitch. News outlets dissected every testimony, every piece of evidence. The advocacy group released a statement urging systemic reforms beyond Mark's case. Lucy read the statement aloud to Alexander at home. This isn't just about one man, she said. It's about fixing a broken system. And it's working, Alexander replied. People are paying attention. But we can't stop now, Lucy said firmly. The final trial has to seal this. As the courtroom prepared for the closing arguments and the final verdict, all eyes were on Mark and the system that had protected him for so long. The courtroom was electric with tension as the final day of Mark's trial began. The prosecution and defense were poised for the showdown that would decide everything. Mark sat stiffly, his expression a mask of defiance. Across the room, Lucy, Marina, Caroline, and Clara sat side by side, their presence a united front. Pablo stood to deliver his closing arguments, his voice calm yet commanding. This case is about accountability. The testimonies of these women, corroborated by Officer Ethan's insider knowledge, reveal a pattern of abuse that cannot be ignored. Officer Mark used his badge as a weapon, not a shield. Today, we ask you to send a clear message. No one is above the law. Douglas Price, Mark's lawyer, countered with a final attempt to sway the jury. My client has been a dedicated public servant for years. The allegations brought against him are riddled with inconsistencies and motivated by personal vendettas. To convict him based on such flimsy evidence would be a miscarriage of justice. The judge signaled for the next phase, and Pablo stood again. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call an additional witness. A ripple of surprise swept through the courtroom. Mark shifted uneasily, whispering to Price, who frowned. This is unexpected, Price muttered. The door to the courtroom opened, and a woman entered. She was middle-aged, with a calm but resolute demeanor. Your Honor, this is Janet Reeves, a former officer who worked alongside the defendant years ago, Pablo announced. Janet took the stand, swearing the oath before meeting the judge's gaze. I served with Officer Mark early in his career, she began. I witnessed behavior that concerned me, targeting vulnerable individuals, excessive force, and a disregard for proper procedure. Price immediately objected. This is hearsay. The witness has no direct connection to the incidents in question. The judge overruled. The court will hear her testimony. Continue, Ms. Reeves. Janet nodded. I reported his actions to my superiors multiple times, but nothing was done. I was eventually pushed out of the department for being difficult. When I heard about this case, I knew I had to come forward. His behavior isn't new. It's a pattern that's been ignored for too long. Pablo seized the moment. Ms. Reeves, do you believe the department protected Officer Mark at the expense of justice? Yes, Janet replied, and it allowed him to escalate to where we are today. Mark's mask of composure cracked. She's lying, he burst out, rising from his seat. The judge banged the gavel. Order! Officer Mark, sit down. But Mark didn't stop. This is a witch hunt. They're all against me. Price grabbed his arm, hissing. You're making it worse. Sit down. During the final cross-examination, Pablo cornered Mark with one last question. Officer Mark, can you look this court in the eye and deny that you abused your authority? Mark hesitated, his gaze darting to the jury, the victims, and finally to Price. The silence was deafening. I did what I thought was necessary, he muttered. That's not an answer, Pablo pressed. Mark's voice rose, desperate now. Fine. Yes, I used my position to control situations. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to get results. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Mark's admission hung in the air like a storm cloud. Price buried his face in his hands, knowing the damage was done. The judge's instructions to the jury were brief. The deliberation felt like an eternity. But after several hours, the foreman returned with the verdict. On the charges of abuse of power and violation of personal rights, we find the defendant, Officer Mark Collins, guilty. The room erupted in a mix of relief and quiet sobs. Mark's shoulders slumped, his bravado finally shattered. The judge continued, Officer Collins, your actions betrayed the trust placed in you by this community. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison and permanently barred from serving in law enforcement. Outside the courthouse, Lucy and the other victims gathered, the weight of the moment sinking in. Marina wiped a tear from her cheek. We did it, she said softly. It's not just about us, Clara added. It's about everyone he heard who couldn't speak up. Ethan approached, his expression a mixture of relief and regret. I'm sorry it took me so long to do the right thing. Lucy looked at him and smiled faintly. What matters is that you did. In the weeks following the verdict, the ripple effects of the trial became impossible to ignore. News outlets continued to cover the fallout, with headlines praising the courage of Lucy and the other victims. Activists called for broader reforms, and the public began demanding accountability from institutions that had long enabled abuse. At the precinct, conversations among officers shifted. Ethan stood in the break room speaking with Ryan. You were right, Ethan admitted. Staying silent wasn't protecting anyone, least of all myself. Ryan nodded, his face thoughtful. What you did took guts. And honestly, it's made me think about the things I've let slide. I always thought being a good cop meant loyalty, but now I see it's about integrity. Across the room, Turner glanced at them, his expression unreadable. The weight of what had transpired seemed to hang heavy in the air. Lucy, meanwhile, had thrown herself into advocacy work. She partnered with the women's rights organization that had supported her case, speaking at events and sharing her story. At a community meeting, she stood before a packed room, her voice steady but impassioned. This isn't just about one officer or one case, she said. It's about a system that prioritizes protecting its own over protecting the people it serves. We have to demand better, for ourselves, for our children, and for the future. The audience erupted into applause, but Lucy's focus remained on the faces of those who seemed hesitant, the ones who, like her months earlier, weren't sure they had the strength to fight back. One day, Clara joined Lucy at an event, her children in tow. I never thought I'd be doing something like this, Clara admitted. But watching you stand up, it gave me the courage I didn't know I had. Lucy smiled. You had it all along. Sometimes it just takes seeing someone else use theirs to realize it. Caroline, too, found herself empowered. She began organizing within her workplace, pushing for policies to protect employees from harassment. If someone like Mark ever tries something like that again, she told Lucy, they won't get away with it. Marina, initially reluctant to even speak out, became one of the most vocal advocates. For the longest time, I thought my voice didn't matter, she said during a televised interview. But Lucy and the others showed me that even when it feels like the world is against you, there's strength in unity. Her words resonated deeply, sparking a flood of messages from other victims who had stayed silent out of fear. Even within the police department, change was stirring. New training programs were introduced, and an independent oversight committee was formed to handle complaints. While some resisted, others, like Ryan, saw it as a necessary step forward. During a quiet moment in the precinct, Ryan approached Ethan. You know, for all his bravado, Mark was just a symptom of a bigger problem. If we're serious about fixing things, it's on us to hold each other accountable. Ethan nodded. No more looking the other way. One evening, Lucy returned home after an exhausting day of meetings. Alexander greeted her at the door, a proud smile on his face. You're making waves, he said, handing her a cup of tea. People are listening. Lucy sank into the couch, her body tired but her spirit invigorated. It's not just me. It's everyone who stood up. Clara, Caroline, Marina, Ethan, even Janet. We all played a part. Alexander sat beside her. And what's next? Lucy gazed out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. We keep going. This fight isn't over. And so, Lucy's journey didn't just bring justice to those harmed by Mark. It ignited a larger conversation about the abuse of power and the courage it takes to stand against it. The bravery of Lucy, Marina, Caroline, Clara, and Ethan became a symbol of what can happen when people refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. Their story reminds us that change begins with a single voice, but true impact comes when we stand together. How would you respond if you witnessed abuse of power? Would you have the courage to act? If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that inspire change. Together, we can amplify these voices and create a better world.